Hi, folks. This is Mr. Thomas, your friendly neighborhood film instructor once again, and I am creating this video to talk more about Chapter 8, the advanced editing techniques that we learn in DMPT 2615 Intermediate Editing. And the last video was about, last two videos were about pretty much giving us a basis of what three-point editing technique is all about. Okay, and I started off by in episode 1 for chapter 8 talking about the traditional three-point edit that we've done in Premiere so far, which is setting an in point and an out point in the source monitor with some loaded footage in the source monitor, and then an in point in the timeline panel, and then executing an edit. We talked about patching our source track indicators in our timeline headers, or track headers, sorry, our source track indicators and our track headers. We talked about patching those so the correct video and audio clips from the source monitor would fall into the correct video and audio tracks in the timeline. And we also, in the second video, we talked about how you can vary that in-point, that three-point edit combination. Instead of doing an in-point and an out-point in the source monitor and an in-point in the timeline, I showed you how you can set an in-point in the source monitor and an in-point and an out-point in the timeline, an out-point in the source monitor and an in-point and an out-point in the timeline, an in-point and an out-point in the source monitor and an out-point in the timeline. I know it may sound like a lot of different combinations, and it is, but believe it or not, each one of those combinations has a specific use, okay? One of the easiest things to remember, one of the easiest ways to remember the difference between the different versions of the three-point edit is just remember that the 2 points that coincide between the source monitor and the timeline, what's going to happen is that it's going to Premiere, when you add the edit to the timeline, Premiere is going to match up the clips, match up the frame from the source monitor at, let's just say, the out point. Say we have in and out in the timeline. So we have in and out in the source monitor and out in the timeline. It's going to match up the frame at the out point in the source monitor with the out point in the timeline, and it's going to back time the footage. That means it's going to read all the footage starting at the out point in the source monitor and reading left towards the in point in the source monitor until it has all the footage that you marked in the source monitor down in the timeline. It's just how the difference is how's it getting the footage from the source monitor to the timeline. Something that we mentioned in 2600 that we didn't talk a lot about is that based on where you place your points, your in points and out points in between your source monitor and your timeline, we didn't really talk. We talked a little bit about duration, location, and content, or DLC. That's the mnemonic I remember. Duration, D, location, C, and content. Based on where you place your points in your source monitor and your timeline, it's going to tell you which monitor is determining which one of those three characteristics of a shot. Okay, the shot has a duration or a length. How long is a shot? Is it 2 seconds? Is it 5 seconds? Is it 5 minutes long? A single shot. Location, meaning that in your timeline, where does the clip fall in the timeline? Is it the first shot in the timeline? Is it the 7th shot in the timeline? Is it the 5th shot in the timeline? Also, location can be defined as what's the time code at which the clip falls in the timeline. Okay, that's usually determined by the endpoint that you set in the timeline, if you have one there. And finally, the content. Say you have a 3-minute clip, okay, and you have an in point and an out point in the source monitor that only defines 10 seconds of that 3-minute clip, okay? Now, which 10 seconds of that 3-minute clip have you marked to be edited into the timeline? Have you marked the first 10 seconds in the source monitor? Have you marked the last 10 seconds in the source monitor? Have you marked the middle 10 seconds of the footage in the source monitor with an in point and an out point to be edited down to the timeline? Okay, so as you can see, content addresses which specific part of the clip loaded into the source monitor do you have marked with an in point and an out point. Okay, so I always tell students, anytime you're watching your timeline, watching a sequence, watching your work, and something doesn't look right with it, I tell them always go back to the basics. Look at each clip and ask them, is the duration of the clip correct? Is it too long? Is it too short? Is the location of the clip correct? Is it in the right sequence? Maybe it's the first clip in the timeline and it should be in the last clip. It should be the last clip in the timeline. Okay. And finally, is the content of the shot in the timeline correct? Of all the footage within the clip in the source monitor that I edited to the timeline, of all the footage that was in that source monitor, did I get the correct, let's say, 10 seconds of it? You know, maybe I used the first 10 seconds of the source clip loaded into the source monitor, and I should have used the last 10 seconds. So that addresses the issue of content. Okay, duration, location, and content. If I set an in point and an out point in my source monitor and an in point in my timeline, then of course the duration of the clip that's going to be in the timeline is established in the source monitor, the amount of time between the in point and the out point in the source monitor. Okay, the location of that clip in the timeline is going to be of course determined from the location of the endpoint in the timeline. Okay, and the content of the footage that's going to be edited to the timeline, that's once again determined by the source monitor, which 10 seconds is marked in the source monitor. Okay, let's look at one more example because I'll let you do the rest of the combinations on your own. Say I set an in point in my source monitor, but an in point and an out point in my timeline. Okay, as far as duration, the duration of the shot that ultimately ends up in the timeline is determined by the timeline. Okay, because I have an in point and an out point set in my timeline and only an in point in my source monitor. So that in point, my source monitor is going to tell me when I'm going to start taking footage from that source clip in the timeline, but it doesn't tell me how much footage it's going to take. It'll give me as much as I want until media end, that is the very last frame of footage that I shot. Okay, that's what it would give to me if I had no marks or no points in the timeline. But since I have an in point and an out point in the timeline, it's going to match up the frame at the in point within the source monitor with the in point in the timeline, and it's only going to take as much footage from that source monitor that it needs to fill between the in point and the out point in the timeline. So as you can see, the duration is determined by the timeline in that case. Okay. And finally, once again, if I have an in point, my source monitor, and an in point and an out point, my timeline, as far as content is really determined by both the source monitor and the timeline. Okay, because of the fact that the source monitor, of course, determines where I'm going to start taking footage. The timeline determines how much footage I'm going to take. So, you know, you really don't get an idea of the exact content I'm using just from the source monitor. Okay, you really don't get an exact definition or exact idea of what kind of footage, the content of the footage just from the timeline, but it's a combination of where I start taking footage in the source monitor with the amount of footage that I'm going to take, the duration of my footage, which I get from my timeline. Okay, let me say that again. It's a combination of my in point in my source monitor, which tells me where I'm going to start taking footage from my source monitor, and the in point and my out point in my timeline, which tells me how much footage I'm going to take from my source monitor to edit to my timeline. Those two elements together determine the content that's going to be in my timeline. So duration, location, content can be determined by the different points in the source monitor and the timeline, depending upon where your points fall in your source monitor and your timeline. Okay, so we have 3-point edits out of the way. We can move on to performing advanced editing techniques with 4-point edits in chapter 8, and we will move on to that in our next clip.